Hi, Robert.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Good. Just another quiet, normal week in Cairo.
Yes, we should tell people you're in Cairo. This is in fact an episode of Worldwise, a show on Blogging Heads where we usually talk to people who are in various other countries. Now, unlike other people who are reporting from Cairo now, and a lot of people are because of the protests and disturbances in that part of the world generally, but unlike many of these people, you are awaiting trial in Cairo. At least you were last time I spoke to you. You had been arrested along with a number of other workers in NGOs who had been there helping to prepare for the Egyptian election. The Americans who were arrested were offered the opportunity to go to leave and escape trial. All of them did except for you. You are there along with your Egyptian colleagues in the NGO world, some of whom are also awaiting trial. And before we get started on the events in Egypt, is there any update on your status?
Actually, we were in court on Sunday. There were 16 of us in the court dock, or the cage, as they call it here. There is another American who is also here, an Egyptian American. There is a German citizen who's there, and then so there's 16 total and 13 Egyptians. Mm-hmm. It was a lengthy court session, approximately 7 hours. There were 5 different witnesses for the prosecution. The main accuser in the case, former Minister of International Cooperation, Faiza Al-Naga, did appear. And we have maintained all along that this is a political case, and her 2 hours of testimony did a great deal of justice to cement the opinion that it is politics. At not one time in these court proceedings, which have been ongoing since late February, has any of our individual names been mentioned. The testimony of all the government officials focused on Egypt-United States relationships had nothing to do specifically with the work that we were doing here in Egypt. So next court hearing is October 2nd, and we're going to soldier on.
What are the formal charges, just quickly?
I am charged with managing an illegal NGO and illegally receiving foreign funding, both of which are not true. The organization that I work for, the National Democratic Institute, complied fully with Egyptian law as written by the Egyptian government for the 6 years that NDI operated in Egypt. Mm-hmm. So the armed raid happened at the end of December last year on the eve of the third round of the parliamentary elections. We, at the time, were officially accredited and sanctioned by the Egyptian government as international election monitors. And despite the armed raid and the stripping of everything from the offices, computers, files, etc., we still proceeded with our mission as observers in the third round of the elections in early January of this year.
Okay. Well, good luck. I don't know when, if ever, this is going to end, but you are free until
yes,
until the conclusion of the trial.
Yes. In January throughout February, I was travel banned. Once the bail agreements were arranged for the foreign accused, my travel ban was lifted. I have since come and gone freely a few times. We continue to show up in court and proclaim our innocence, and as they say here in Egypt, inshallah, we will be found not guilty, sometime in the near future.
Okay, well, good luck.
Thank you.
So, hectic times there in Cairo. Now, it's later on Friday there than it is here, so the events, I guess, have partly unfolded by now. What's it like there?
Well, it's been a little chaotic in and around the U.S. Embassy and Tahrir Square. Fortunately, this morning, President Morsi addressed the nation, calling for Muslims to do their duty to protect foreign embassies and the guests in this country, which I think has helped to ramp down some of the violence so far. I have been, just prior to this call, was watching on Twitter. There's a few journalists that I'm familiar with that are currently in the square, and there is a small crowd. It's not as big as some people had thought, but it is still sort of ongoing. There is a general sense that a large portion of this crowd, it's not about this film anymore. I was out and about in Cairo quite a bit yesterday, and most of my Muslim friends and people I also just don't know, they don't know what the film is. They haven't seen it.
What is it about if it's not about the film? I mean, many of them I gather are citing the film, even if they're not familiar with it. But is that right? But your sense is that it's not the ultimate grievance.
Well, it started with that on Tuesday, which unfortunately was also the anniversary of September the 11th. It started earlier that day on Salafi religious television channels, sort of complaining about the film and calling for protests. So on Tuesday evening, it appeared to be mostly a Salafi crowd, which is a sort of an ultra-conservative sect of the Islamic faith.
Right.
And there was
and a rival to the Muslim Brotherhood for power there, I gather.
Yes, no, sort of depends on the issue. The Salafi movement did form a political party during the parliamentary elections last year. They won approximately 25% of the vote in Parliament. Mm-hmm. But the interesting thing is that there was initially very lax security on the outside of the U.S. Embassy. When security did arrive in force, the crowd seemed to have changed. Now, I have not gone down there myself because it's just not a wise and safe thing to do right now while tensions are high. But I've been sort of closely following the reports. The crowd did shift to a little bit more of a younger crowd, and their grievances seem to be more against the police. Now, today, it seems like a mixed crowd. The Muslim Brotherhood initial response was to call for a day of rage on Friday after the noon prayers. They then backed off that call. So there is some sort of general frustration and anger. There is some anger with the film, but it is not, fortunately, I've seen no reports so far of any fatalities. Mm-hmm. There were reports last night of a couple hundred injured. There is a heavy use of tear gas now, but most of the protest seems to be in the square, which would be a block or two away from the U.S. Embassy.
Mm-hmm. Now, Isander El Amrani, if I'm pronouncing his name right, who writes a blog called The Arabist and is usually based in Cairo, I think, has written that one thing that this is about, in the minds of some of these people, is American foreign policy, or at least anti-Americanism more than anti-filmism, Is that your sense?
Yeah, I think there is some of that. I mean, look, the initial sort of call for here, and I know that there are protests going on in other countries, and while there seems to be the film that is uniting it and some anti-Americanism, there are different causes, at least on the ground here. It is kind of hard to judge, but there is in Egypt, as in most countries of the world and most religions of the world, there are the religious extremists, and with the sort of the shock that the world saw on Tuesday night when the U.S. Embassy here was breached and the flag was taken down. I sort of pointed out that it's easy to overreact in situations like this. I mean, based on the crowd estimates, it was 0.00002% of the entire population of Egypt was actually on the streets. And then, like I say, the next day.
In fact, I mean, the other, I guess you alluded to this. The other thing that Isander also said was that the initial protest came largely at the instigation of these Salafis. That it was much of it was more organized than maybe we imagined.
Yes, and it had the appearance of being spontaneous, and unfortunately, in this part of the world, there is sort of a culture of rumors and conspiracy theories. I've kind of looked at it at its face value. It was September 11th, which is it's a day of mourning, and for some in the world, a day of rage for some in the world. It is sort of symbolic of the relationships between the Muslim world and the West. But there were Al-Qaeda Islamic flags that were readily distributed in the crowd. There were ladders brought down. There were pre-printed signs. I saw some reports. So it appears here that there might have been an organized effort. And I don't want to sort of delve into conspiracy theories, but the timing beyond September 11th, there was also a large delegation of U.S. Business leaders that were here working with the American Chamber of Commerce and some Egyptian business interests, to sort of promote foreign investment and jobs. So there is a possibility that there may be some motives behind this, that it was to sort of embarrass the current government. But again, I don't, it's really sort of hard to tell.
Well, that's why I brought up the fact that the Salafis are in some context a rival of the current government, and
Yep.
And some people have said that is a reason that the government, well, the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, of which the president is a member, has been kind of supporting these demonstrations once they got off the ground. Some people are reading that as an attempt, to kind of outflank the Salafis, or at least to eat into their support, or to avoid being outflanked on the radical edge. And you're suggesting that the instigation of the thing may make sense in that context as intra-Egyptian political competition.
Yeah, I've seen some statements coming from the president calling for an investigation of sort of the incident on Tuesday. Much like the origin of this anti-Islamic film, there's a lot of sort of mystery, and I think we have to sort of everyone remain calm. Let's investigate what is going on. But also, there has to be some leadership. This is a new government here. I have been vocal at sometimes. Their crisis communication is a little slow on the draw. It took the president almost a full day to react. Fortunately, yesterday one of the leading members of the Muslim Brotherhood published a letter in the New York Times saying that the President Obama and the American people were not responsible for this. And I had pointed out last night on Twitter that most Egyptians that I know don't read the New York Times. That message needs to be brought inside the country. And unfortunately, this morning the president did sort of back off on the call of protest. So a little slow on the response, but there was a response that I think has sort of damped down some of the tensions today.
Yeah, now in America, the administration is kind of implicitly taking credit for this change of tone on the part of the Egyptian leadership. There was a story in the New York Times this morning that was very clearly a leak from the administration. It was attributed to an anonymous administration official describing this phone call between Obama and President Morsi, in which Obama kind of laid down the law. I forget the details. I'm sure it had something to do with the amount of money we give them and how that might be imperiled and so on. So they're trying to depict this. The administration is trying to depict this as a result of Obama's intervention, I think.
Yeah, and look, it is a crisis. Like I say, fortunately here in Egypt, the breach of the embassy didn't cause a loss of life. In a time of crisis, you have different responses from different leaders. I think the President Obama's remark, I believe from yesterday or 2 days ago, that Egypt was not an ally but was also not an enemy, rattled a lot of people here in Cairo. And quite frankly, I think he was accurate to depict it that way. I mean, this is not the first time that the Egyptian government has sort of, there's been an attack on American interests here. I mean, my case would be a perfect example. I mean, that was earlier this year. President Obama needed to sort of take a firm stand here. And what I think part of this is you have a collision of cultures. I mean, most Egyptians that I know, want the freedom of speech, but they don't understand that freedom of speech can also include insulting a religion. And sort of my, on the street with my friends in Cairo, it's the fine line between freedom of speech and hate crimes.
Yeah, on that note, tell me, is it the case that, Egypt is a state where the government has traditionally had a fair amount of control over media? In fact, I assume that the only movies that show in actual theaters in Egypt are in some sense government approved. I would guess that the government has the power to keep anything from showing. Maybe I'm wrong, but is it the case that a lot of Egyptians don't understand that the U.S. government just really doesn't have the power to control, even if it had the inclination? The U.S. government just can't, keep films from showing up, especially on YouTube.
Yes, and again, it's been very difficult to sort of follow the origin of this film. It is currently, you cannot watch it on YouTube now in Egypt. It's been blocked. I had the misfortune of actually seeing the film before it was blocked, and I can tell you as a non-Muslim,
the film or the trailer?
The trailer, I'm sorry.
Right.
I can tell you, as a non-Muslim, it offended me. It was just an offensive movie. And so, but having said that, it was on YouTube. Even in countries that do block access to the internet, sometimes there are ways to get around that. I think that the message that needs to be loud and clear now is that that this movie is not the fault of the President of the United States or the fault of the American people. Right. I'm not familiar with sort of the legal precedent on hate crimes in the United States, but it could be that if the intent was to incite violence, there could be laws in our books that can do something about this, but an investigation has to run its course.
Conceivably, I also read that the Obama administration has asked YouTube if this happens to violate YouTube's written standards. Of course, that still wouldn't get it off the web entirely. You can always find a place to post it. But
and I think what the two countries have to sort of understand, and countries beyond just Egypt in this part of the world, is that there has to be mutual respect, mutual cooperation, but we also have to recognize the cultural differences. Mm-hmm. While it inflames. The freedom of speech that the United States has a tolerance of religion. I mean, as offensive as this Terry Jones from Florida, the Koran burning pastor, as offensive he is to me and despicable as an American, he does have a right to be, and I'll just use blunt language, he has a right under our Constitution to be an asshole. Mm-hmm. Like I said, alluded to earlier, religious extremists are a plague on all religions and all nations. There were reports this morning that on one of the Salafi television shows they burned the Bible. That is, to me, an extreme response as well. And, quite frankly, not one that is condoned by the teachings of the Quran. The Quran does command respect to people of other religions. So,
in fact, the Bible is a fairly sacred text in Islam. It doesn't rank up there with the Quran, but I mean, the whole biblical narrative is embraced in the Quran.
Well, and a lot of
except for a few theological points like Jesus being actually the Son of God, but I won't get into that.
Yeah, but and a lot of people here in Cairo have been pointing out that this sort of is a diversion from the bigger problems, and quite frankly, this incident is pointing to some of that. I mean, there is the economy here has been teetering for a while. There is a crisis in jobs. There is also still sort of a lack of security and a crisis in that area. So, and also from a global context, while the world is now focused on protest throughout the Middle East. Daily, hour by hour, human rights violations are going on in Syria and Bahrain that have sort of taken a back seat to this. So this is an unfortunate diversion, and hopefully the leaders of Egypt, the leaders of the United States, the leaders of the other countries in the region can get this sort of situation calmed down. Mm-hmm. The religious extremists, have to be sort of, put into place that they are. And stop the violence and focus on the bigger picture of what's important. And in relations, it's mutual respect, mutual cooperation, but also sort of getting to the root of a lot of the problems here, and that's lack of jobs, lack of security, lack of education, and unfortunately for President Morsi, he's inherited a 30-year sort of disaster that it's going to take time to fix.
Now, you mean, when you say those are the real issues, do you mean in the sense that some of the people out on the streets are motivated by a vague discontent having to do with, among other things, the fact that they don't have jobs or good jobs or something?
I think that is playing a role in it. Mm-hmm. Again, insulting the Islamic faith is a red line in this part of the world. This sort of protests the origin. I spent Wednesday and Thursday out and about and on the streets, and I was actually downtown last night. I haven't met a single Muslim that has actually seen the film.
Yeah,
and
but they're upset about it.
Yeah, well, and part of that is leadership. I think that the political leaders and to some extent the religious leaders need to step into this vacuum and set the record straight. It is now blocked here. The president of the United States has made it very clear that it's offensive to him. Mm-hmm. Most of the leaders here have also sort of said the same thing. But it's got to be loud and clear. The voices.
Well, and I think the thing you said earlier, what's maybe the most important message is just for them to truly understand that there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, there's that. Not only do we condemn it, but we don't have the power really to do much more than that. And in the current age, especially when anybody can put anything up on the web, we're going to have to successfully convey that message, I think.
Yeah, and I think the message from the United States is that our country is founded on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which unfortunately gives idiots the right to be idiots. But excuse me, in this case, I think the president has denounced the film. Like I say, I think to me and to most Americans, it is an offensive film. It is historically inaccurate. It is silly. It is disgusting. And I think as long as American voices keep continuing to say that, and then hopefully in this country, the president and the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood continue to say that this is not the fault of the American president, the American people, that hopefully that by tomorrow this thing can be died down.
Is it your sense that it's winding down now? I know in other parts of the Muslim world things are getting cranked up. There was a Kentucky Fried Chicken burned somewhere, maybe in
Yemen.
Where was that burned in? Was that in
Yemen, I believe.
That was in Yemen. And then in Khartoum, I believe that the German embassy I read was burned, and that maybe the British embassy was stormed or something. I mean, so things are gearing up elsewhere. But is it your sense that in Egypt maybe the climax has been passed?
Inshallah. I actually have my Twitter stream open. I mean, there's still a crowd. But again, I was out this morning, and nobody I know, and I live 2 neighborhoods over from Tahrir Square, nobody I knew was joining this. So again, it is a very, very small portion of the population. I've seen no reports of any significant protests in other parts of Egypt. So hopefully it'll be winding down. Again, this government, and again, I keep sort of urging patience. It has been sort of a 1 step forward, 2 step backwards summer, but they have inherited a 30-year mess. And so it is going to take time, and they do need to put more of a focus on jobs and security and education. And the infrastructure decline that they've inherited cannot be fixed in the course of 1 summer. So hopefully this will be over and they can move on. Because, and look, I watch, being an American in Cairo, I see everything that's coming out of the United States. And last week I saw an interview where my former boss, former Governor Bill Richardson, was on Fox with Hannity. I don't know why. But Hannity asked one of those rapid-fire, 10-point questions about how disastrous the Obama administration is, and Governor Richardson didn't address it. But one of those was that the Arab Spring was a failure. And I've seen this coming out of some of the politics in America. And I say to anyone in the West that thinks the American Spring has been a failure, people have been liberated from despots and dictators in the past year and a half, and freedom from tyranny is never a failure. And anybody in the United States that wants to call this a failure needs to review the United States' own history. Our revolution lasted a long time. it took us over a decade to formalize our Constitution. 80 years into our history, we had a civil war. Democracy, I often have said here that democracy is messy. I actually read a quote last night from Nathan Brown, wrote in the New Republic, that democracy is beautiful, but democratic politics itself is ugly. So this process takes time, and the United States, and Egypt and the other countries in the region, we all need to take a step back and focus on the big picture. These democracies are going to take time to emerge and to mature. The United States can play a role in helping, and the partnerships that the West and this part of the world have are very important to the future. So I'm hoping that everyone will calm down. There was a second thing that was coming out of the U.S. Oh yeah, there's been a lot of sort of criticism with President Morsi. One of the other things I saw was a criticism coming out of some of the right wing in the U.S. that the president of Egypt went to Iran and how awful that was. I actually give the president of Egypt credit for going to Tehran and in the presence of Ahmadinejad and the Syrians, blasting the Syrian regime. So while this government has been sort of back and forth on some things, foreign policy-wise, I thought that was the right message, and a gutsy message.
I think he surprised some people. I think some of the criticism of him for going came before he actually delivered that message, and came from people who didn't anticipate him giving any friction at all to the Iranian government. But that was significant friction.
I wouldn't go to Tehran and tell Ahmadinejad to his face that he's wrong. I didn't.
No, I mean, in general, my sense, tell me what you think, is that, in principle, this government, a lot of people in America hear that it's an Islamist government, the Muslim Brotherhood is Islamist. My sense is that, so far as we know right now, this is a government that we could do business with and that could play a constructive role in that region. I mean, at least that thesis hasn't been disproved, but tell me what your sense is.
Well, yes, and look, it is an Islamist government. I mean, fact, and there's a lot of...
and we should spell out the meaning of that. That means that they think that fundamentally, in some sense, Egyptian law should be grounded in Islamic law as the ultimate authority. Is that what that means to you? Which isn't incompatible with democracy, but
not at all. And it's the constitutional sort of struggle to get the Constitution is ongoing. They've had quite a few stops and starts through the spring and summer, but there will be a constitutional document coming out, and the prior Constitution was grounded in the principles of Sharia, which is a scary word to a lot of Westerners, but the word means law. There's been a lot of sort of liberal voices and secular voices here in Egypt that have been crying out that Obama abandoned them, and that the voters spoke in this country. In a free and fair election for parliament, which has now been dissolved, and in a free and fair election for president. And the majority of voters chose Morsi to be the president. In democracy, that is how it works. Now, the struggle that this government will have is a constitution shouldn't be decided by 50% plus one. A constitution has to guarantee rights and liberties for all. And that is going to be a struggle as this document gets produced and the arguments back and forth take. But it is a government that I think that the Western world can do business with. It has inherited a lot of problems, and it's going to take time and it's going to take patience. The sort of the mutual respect and the not overreacting to things. Insults go both ways. I've had a lot of Egyptians praise Secretary Clinton's behavior when she was here earlier this summer. She was leaving a speech in Alexandria, and her motorcade was assaulted with.
That's because some
tomatoes.
People on the American right had whipped up this rumor, that that her assistant I forget, was some kind of Muslim Brotherhood plant or something.
Right, that was, yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, I
again,
think that was what was behind that, right? Some total misconception? Right.
Yeah, well, and when you talk about, religious extremists, sort of trying to foul up relations, I would throw Michelle Bachmann right into that bag. But Secretary Clinton's motorcade was hit with tomatoes, and rather than getting angry and ranting and raving about it, her statement was that it was a perfectly good waste of good tomatoes, which was the type of humor that most people that I know in this country appreciated. So, again, it's a clash of cultures, but we're not that different. The dreams of a typical Muslim man or woman are very similar to what they are in the Western world. They want a better life for their children. They want security for their families. They want dignity and respect and opportunity for jobs. And so, on the streets of Cairo and throughout this country, the aspirations of the common sort of everyday citizens are no different than they are in the West.
Can you tell me something? You said earlier that when Obama made this remark about Egypt not necessarily being an ally right now, although not an enemy, that unsettled some people in Cairo. I'm curious, what kinds of people get unsettled by that? Are you talking about secular liberals in Egypt? Are you talking about political leaders, journalists? What kinds of people?
It unsettled people from a broad range. I can tell you, one of the first questions I had, after that had happened, and it had sort of permeated through the Egyptian media, was right on my corner. Several of the taxi drivers, they were lamenting that there was nobody on the streets, and there's people that depend on tourism, and so it was unsettling because despite sort of some of the differences over the years, Barack Obama is still relatively popular amongst the people in this country. I don't get a lot of anti-American backlash when I'm walking around the streets here. So I think it was something that the president needed to say. I think it has gotten the president of Egypt's undivided attention on it. And like I say, hopefully you get to the sort of the bigger picture of mutual cooperation and respect and move it forward, because again, the diversion, I pointed out that, the 0.0002% were protesting at the embassy. That same night, there were an estimated 35 million Egyptians that were going to sleep living in dire poverty. And that, to me, is a bigger priority for what we need to focus on for the future.
Okay. Can you still hear me?
I can.
Okay. Sorry, I was having trouble hearing you, but I think we're back. Tell us something about, as we've learned more about the making of this thing that I think barely qualifies for the term film, and the financing of it, it turns out that there's apparently, the best theory now is that there some Egyptian or formerly Egyptian Coptic Christian may have played a leading role. I assume you've heard this, right?
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that it was a fake named Israeli American. There's been a lot of sort of back and forth.
Yeah, originally, it was someone who claimed they were Israeli American. That seems increasingly implausible, and what seems more and more plausible is that they may be Coptic. And can you tell us a little something about, I assume if that's the case, that it reflects some kind of tension between Coptic Christians and Muslims in Egypt, or at least some that was perceived by this particular Coptic Christian. Have you gotten any kind of sense for that while you've been there?
Yeah, there is some tension. Again, it goes to sort of leadership. There was an incident earlier this summer, and I forget the name of the village, but it was in the governorate of Giza, just across the river from Cairo. And there was apparently a Muslim man's shirt was burned by an iron, and there were some insults hurled, and the next thing you know, there was violence. And again, in situations like that, the leaders of the government need to speak up. They need to take charge. They need to calm down tensions. I referenced sort of earlier in the United States with the freedom of speech, and then the ongoing Constitution here. I mean, I think there has to be some focus here on the rights of minorities, but whether they be Coptic or Bedouin or Nubian. Those guarantees have to be sort of fostered for all 90 million people that are living here.
And hasn't President Morsi said some encouraging things about that?
He has. But when there is sectarian violence ongoing on the streets, this government needs to step up and say something. There's been a slow response on some of the crises that have gone on this summer. And look, there have been more than one sort of big-time crises. I mean, during Ramadan, you had 16 Egyptian soldiers that were murdered during Iftar, on the border with Israel. So, I mean, it's been no shortage of sort of prime-time crises that this president has had to deal with in the first 2 months that he's been here. But, again, it goes back to the Constitution, and this is where, the president, the prime minister, the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood need to think about the future. While 50% plus one in a democracy will get you in office, when you're making a constitution, it cannot be 50% plus one. It has to be inclusive. Egypt has a long history of very good relations between Copts and Muslims, and the new constitution needs to guarantee that.
And isn't the case that still relations are good between Copts and most Egyptian Muslims?
Yes.
But there is a specific subset of Egyptian Muslims. I mean, for example, is it the Salafis by and large that have the trouble with the Copts, or is it lower income Muslims, or what? Is there any demographic face you can put on this?
It seems to vary, and let me just say this too. I mean, when we're talking about religious extremists and this current crisis being caused by a Salafi, a TV show, and a cleric, calling for the violent protests. I know quite a few Salafis, and I actually talked to a few yesterday. They also are not supporting this sort of. So I wouldn't put every Salafi in Egypt into the same boat.
Right.
I know some very good Salafis, and I worked with some during my work here with the election last year. So it's look, anybody that ever goes in an interview like this, whether it be with you or any other Western journalist, and claims to have full knowledge of what is going on in Egypt is lying to you. It is a very complicated society and structure. That just you can't answer questions in the way that we're used to in the West, where you put people in sort of categories and boxes.
Okay. Listen. Final question: when you have encounters with a whole variety of Egyptians, including cab drivers, I know you said that the general drift is a favorable reaction. I gather to your being an American, or at least there's a lot of that. You said to the extent that you get. Either critical feedback or out-and-out hostility. How would you characterize it? What do you think is behind it? Are there misconceptions or accurate conceptions about Americans or American policy, or what?
Yeah, some of all of that. Look, I'm a proud American, but I live in this part of the world, so I can sort of understand when. When a drone attack, kills one terrorist, but also, harms, a dozen innocents.
Does that have ramifications in Egypt?
Yeah,
because it's never happened in Egypt.
It hasn't happened in Egypt, but it's in the news here.
And so that has an effect. When it happens in Yemen, you're saying that hurts America's profile in Egypt.
Yeah, it does. And again. But with a lack of sort of understanding, there are quite a few people that I know that completely sort of, understand the tactic. But then there are others, and there's a lot of critics in the United States. But our relationship with Israel and our perceived lack of concern for Palestine is a major driving force for anti-Americanism here. And it's again. What is in the best interest of the United States, as I point out to my Egyptian friends, is not always in the best interest of Egyptians. It's a complicated world. I do believe that President Obama has done a much better job of any president in my lifetime to sort of improve the perception of Americans in this part of the world. And it's going to take continued leadership from the presidents of the various emerging democracies in this part of the world, and Obama to keep sort of moving the ball forward. I last night pointed out to a couple of friends of mine that they were sort of talking about Obama's involvement during the Egyptian revolution, and I explained to him that in our democracy, the new president inherits the entire history of the United States. So President Obama inherited our 30-year relation with former President Mubarak. Mm-hmm. And I said, people that...
And how is the role that Obama played during the revolution, the Egyptian revolution, perceived there?
There are some that wanted him to do more, but there's a general sense, and what I always point out is that when it happened, he inherited this longtime ally, and he basically stood aside. He got out of the way. Most sort of thinking people I know, respect that. But then there's also a lot of people that are disappointed that, when the Muslim Brotherhood won these elections, that he recognized the government. So there's it depends on who you talk to. In some respects, U.S. interests here are in a sort of a no-win situation. If you talk to somebody that was a supporter of former President Mubarak, they'll think that Obama betrayed Mubarak by letting him be overthrown.
They wouldn't be happy, I would think.
Yeah, and again, it's the United States has a lot on its plate, for the relationship to continue here, I think it has to be mutual respect. I think that the leaders of both countries have to speak forcefully when religious extremists try to hijack the agenda and try to incite violence. The sort of respect and cooperation needs to continue. And it's never going to be easy, and it's going to take a generation to change sort of mindsets, not only here but in other countries in the region.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much for taking the time, Robert.
My pleasure.
And I hope you'll have time to come back and see us again at some point, and I hope you won't be precluded from that by being in prison. Good luck with your court case.
I hope that too, and hopefully one day maybe you and I can do one of these interviews where there's not a crisis in the streets. That would be a good thing.
That would be nice, but then who would watch?
Yeah, exactly.
The journalist's perennial problem.
I
fear there won't be a shortage of crises for a while.
Yeah, but that's also the thing too, is that there is good news that's coming out of here too. Unfortunately, it's usually the tragedy and the crisis that generates the headlines. So,
well, let's end with a little good news. Give us some.
I've been impressed with the way that Morsi has been handling sort of regional relations here. I referenced it earlier. This issue is distracting from a huge problem that is ongoing in this part of the world, and that's Syria. While there are people that are on the streets protesting, a silly, idiotic film, there are mortars being fired into neighborhoods throughout Syria, and there's death, and there'll be hundreds of people killed and wounded today. And as a brand new president who, he actually has a lot in common with President Obama. He's inherited a bit of an economic mess, but I've been impressed with the way that he has handled this. I mean, calling out Iran in Iran was a bold move, but again, the distractions of what's going on are distracting from the economic crisis that's facing this country, and also the human rights and violence crisis that are going on in Syria and Bahrain.
Okay. All right. Well, that's good. That's good to hear some good news, and I agree with you that in principle, it seems to me that the current leadership could play a constructive role in the region.
Yeah,
so good luck in court. Hope to talk to you before that's resolved, even if possible. But in any event, good luck.
Yep. All right. My pleasure.
Thanks again.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.